This is Wisp, and I already have a video on her. But earlier this year, she received a very interesting augment, and later this year, she will receive another, buff, I guess? So I thought to myself, now is the time to actually see what this augment can do, and let me tell you, it is glorious. Big shout out to all our generous channel members who helped me keep the lights on, and now, let's jump right into it. First things first, let's talk about her kit, but here I want to make a quick disclaimer, and that is that due to the fact that I already have a full Wisp guide, I'm not going to go into great detail on every single skill, but instead, we're mainly going to focus on the 4th skill and the augment, because there is actually a lot lingering below the surface that we need to talk about. And for the rest of the kit, I'm just going to give you a quick recap, starting out with the passive, which makes you invisible to enemies whenever you are in the air. Very cool, and it also triggers effects like, for example, Arcane Crepuscular that activate when invisible. Ability number 1 gives you 3 reservoirs. One of them increases your maximum health and heals you over time, one zaps nearby enemies with electricity, and the third one makes you a speedy girl. Ability number 2 creates a decoy that distracts enemies with her well-equipped bottom, and if you tap the button again, you swap positions and become temporarily invincible. This essentially means you have access to infinite rolling guard. This ability is incredibly strong for survivability, and technically, with it alone, it becomes already almost impossible to ever die. Skill number 3 then, very popular, Breach Surge. You emit surge sparks that blind nearby enemies, and when damaged, there is a chance that they will emit another spark that homes in onto nearby enemies and deals significant damage. One of the strongest damage dealing abilities in the game. However, let's now talk about the big star of the show for today's video, and that would be her 4th ability, Soul Gate, which usually is the one that we always throw out and replace with something else from the Helminth, because in its base version, it's kinda sorta more like the crappy version of Corvex, right? You create this gate to the sun and shoot out a laser beam, but while the damage is like okay, it was never really all that amazing. However, now we have an augment called Cataclysmic Gate, which makes it that it is no longer a channeled ability, but instead, it creates a stationary little portal to the sun, which deals upfront damage first, and then continuous damage over time to all the enemies in an area around it. You can have up to 3 of those on the field at the same time, which is very welcome and allows you to cover a huge area on the battlefield, and the damage over time that it deals is heat damage with 2 ticks per second, and it always force procs heat and radiation with every damage tick. Now, the first synergy that we need to talk about here would be with your first ability, Reservoirs. What happens here is, if you're under the effect of the haze mode, you know, the one that makes you speedy, then in addition to the force proc heat and radiation status effect from the damage over time, it will now also start force procking corrosive, which is incredibly strong because it grinds down enemy armor very quickly, massively increasing your personal damage. And as if that's not enough, if you're also affected by the other 2 buffs from the reservoirs, then you get an additional damage bonus. Technically, it should be 25% bonus damage for both of the other reservoirs, totaling to a maximum of 50%. But apparently there's a bug or something going on right now that caps it at only 25, meaning having both buffs on is not necessary at the moment. Not sure if that's intentional, but hey, just wanted to mention it. Another thing that we should mention here would be Heat Inherit. Due to the fact that we deal a lot of heat damage with the ability, you might be wondering if it is a good idea to use a heat primer to benefit from all the effects of Heat Inherit. And even though I think it's definitely viable, you gotta remember that for Heat Inherit, it all comes down to which source dealt the first heat effect on the enemy. If you want to benefit from it, it needs to be your primer weapon. And the problem is that these AoEs from R4 will A, be on the field for a while, and B, have quite the AoE, meaning a lot of enemies will be hit by their heat first, which will then make it impossible for you to benefit from Heat Inherit. However, now we come to the big feature, and this is actually very important for our damage output. The damage per second that these AoEs deal is affected by universal weapon bonuses, you know, stuff like Arcane Arachne, Vigorous Swap, Nourish, and all that good stuff. So technically, if we were to have a lot of these bonuses, then the damage over time would go absolutely crazy. It's just that there is an unfortunate problem with this, and that is that our Soul Gate does not snapshot these buffs. See, what I mean here is, if you go for example for Holster Amp or Vigorous Swap that gives you damage for only 3 seconds, yes, when you're under the effect of that buff and then you cast your ability, it is going to deal a lot of damage, but once these 3 seconds are over for you, then also the damage over time from the ability will reduce at the same point. You can also activate it again to increase the damage back up the moment you do, but because of the fact that it doesn't snapshot, that means you would have to constantly keep swapping weapons whenever the AoE is up, and that is hella cringe to play. The gameplay would be an absolute pain. On the other hand though, Arcane Arachne, yes, it also doesn't snapshot, so if the effect runs out, then the damage is gonna go down. But I think Arachne is not all that big of a problem because it lasts for 30 seconds, and with Wisp's passive that keeps you invisible while being in the air, you're already incentivized to jump around a lot, meaning I think in actual gameplay, wall latching once in a while isn't all too much of an ask, so I think this one would actually be a pretty good option here. Now, technically there are also a lot of other universal weapon bonuses. I don't want to go over all of them because most of them don't apply here anyway. As for Nourish and Roar, let's talk about those as we get into the build now. Before that though, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that would be super amazing because it always helps big time with the YouTube algorithm. So cheers so much for your support. But now that we have the full picture about her abilities and especially the 4 with the augment, let's take a look at how you can build Wisp if you wanted to explore this 4th ability more. And the first thing I want to say here is that for weapons and companions and everything else, it really doesn't matter all that much. Go with whatever you see fit for your personal playstyle. For example, if you wanted to go for Heat Inherit, then you would naturally want to have a weapon that works well with that. If you want to group up and pull in enemies, then you could use the Sciatid as a secondary weapon, you could use Nautilus as your companion. If you want to focus solely on casting abilities and not use weapons at all, you could use Shade, for example, to gain constant invisibility. That would open up some opportunities. Panzerwolperpfeiler for the viral priming. What I'm trying to say here is, there are options, but you don't need anything specific for the build that I'm going to show you today. Let's next take a look at helmet options, and this one is unfortunately very, very critical. See, usually on a quote-unquote standard Wisp build, we would subsume over the 4 because that is the most expandable ability out of the kit. However, since today we are actually focusing on the 4, that is not possible, and this is a problem. Our first ability, we definitely need that because it A, gives bonus damage to the 4, and B, it gives it the Force proc corrosive effects, which is very, very strong and powerful, and that is before we get into all the other positive buffs that it gives to you and the team. Then Breach Surge in the 3rd slot. This is A survivability tool because it blinds enemies, and B, it's a lot of free damage, so I really wouldn't want to subsume over that one either. Meaning the only ability that doesn't directly contribute to our build here would be the 2nd, but I would be very careful in subsuming over that one either, because this is such a strong survivability tool by making enemies completely ignore you while the clone is out, and being an infinitely recastable rolling guard on top. It would be very risky to throw this one out, and you would have to rely heavily on the invisibility provided by your passive. Not necessarily the best position to be in either. So yeah, you gotta decide for yourself if you really want to use a helmet ability. For today, I am not going to do that, but I'm still gonna give you some options that I think would be very strong with this setup. And that will be, on the one hand, of course, the no-brainer, Roar, right? Not only increasing the direct damage of the ability, but since Roar is also considered faction damage, that means it double dips on damage over time effects, making all the heat DOTs that you're gonna deal with the 4 significantly stronger. And then the other option would be Nourish, which on the one hand means you will never ever have to worry about energy anymore. And the wiki states that the damage bonus from Nourish actually applies to the damage over time from our 4, so I think that would be a pretty helpful choice too. I know, 2 very generic options right here, but hey, if they work, then well, they work. Up next, let's take a peek at the Archon shards. On the one hand, if you just wanted to have the absolute maximum damage possible, then you would go with 5 Tau Forged Orange shards. all into more ability damage against enemies affected by radiation. That is very easy to achieve because our 4th ability is going to put so much radiation on the enemies. And in case you didn't know, the ability damage bonuses from Archon shards are multiplicative to other ability damage sources, so going all orange here would be a noticeable damage increase. However, in my personal opinion, I would rather only go with 3 Tau-Forged oranges for the damage, and then in the other 2 slots, I would go with a Tau-Forged yellow one for the casting speed, because given how much we're gonna use the 4, I think the casting animation is just a little bit too tedious. And in the last slot, I would go for a Tau-Forged green one, which allows us to get 13 corrosive status effects on the enemy, giving them a total armor reduction of 98%. With all the corrosive that we will be inflicting, this is a very good option too. However, let's now talk about the full build. This right here would be it, with of course Cataclysmic Gate, the Augment 4R4, which is, the main purpose of the build. And because it deals so much heat damage over time and heat status effects, we also go with Archon Vitality, which as a sub-effect doubles the heat procs applied by abilities, which is very, very cool. I left this one unranked because it didn't really fit the polarity. You could max it out too if you wanted to be a bit more health tanky and secure on that front. I just think that with the enemy blinding from Breach Surge and the invisibility from our passive and our 2 and the healing from a reservoir, right, this is going to give us enough survivability. We don't need to invest in extra health here. And then in the aura, you're technically also free to go for whatever you like. I went for corrosive projection, reducing enemy armor a little bit further. Growing power for more ability strength would also be a fair option, or holster amp if you like the pain. The main portion of the build focuses mostly on range, so we have a good AoE on our 4th ability, and also good for the Breach Surge sparks, 42.3 meters. That is a decent range, should work for most tile sets. And that's why we go for Overextended as well as Archon Stretch. And then because Overextended gives us negative ability strength, we counteract that by using Blind Rage and Precision Intensify. For this one, there is a lot to say actually. Yes, I personally decided to go for Precision Intensify to make sure that our 4th ability deals the maximum damage possible. However, it would also be perfectly fair to go for Umbral Intensify in this slot, which would give less damage to the 4, but therefore your Breach Surge would get more damage for the Surge Sparks. And because of the fact that our 1st ability heals us, we could also go for Archon Intensify, which would give us technically 60% ability strength. But for this specific build here, I don't think it would be a great option because it focuses heavily on being invisible and avoiding to take damage in the first place, which means Archon Intensify is probably not going to be consistently up. Then Transient Fortitude would also be an option, giving you 55% ability strength, but it costs you ability duration, and I really didn't want to sacrifice that here. And as if that's not enough, you could also even go for Energy Conversion, which gives you 50% without any penalties. And I think that's actually a pretty viable solution here, because for our energy economy, we go with Arcane Universal Fallout, which will shower us in universal orbs due to all the radiation status effects that we will apply. Then finally, we also go for some duration with Prime Continuity as well as Constitution, and in the last Arcane slot, I decided to go with Arcane Arachne because it is a big damage bonus to our 4th ability, and with the 30-second duration, I think this one is the most comfortable to use here. And if you want to know more about her super powerful regular playstyle, then definitely check out my original Wisp video right here. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demon Nortzel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Underkania 2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morazaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hand Tagas, Patrasader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awindai, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.